What people also don't seem to grasp is that with this short-term help, corporations only keep status quo in the undeveloped regions of the world, making them dependent on Western help, which might not come this year and certainly won't get to all we need, while the imperialist forces continue to rob them of their resources, leaving them unable for any kind of development. By encouraging mercy in the form of charity and philanthropy, the NGO sector undermines the struggle for radical changes which might put an end to the causes of poverty, hunger, sickness, illiteracy, and all the other misfortunes whose victims would not have to wait for mercy and the occasional help by Western charity organisations. Corporations don't finance only NGO projects surrounding quote-unquote care for the community, but they invest even more in spreading the quote-unquote political NGO sector, through which they can impose their own agendas for sustaining the status quo of the society as it is. Governments also mostly direct their funds towards this kind of NGOs, and in the case of Macedonia, a great amount of those funds serve the mass propaganda for entering the EU and NATO. These funds, along with the rest, all serve the top goal of Macedonia to develop into a capitalist state of the Western type. So why do capitalists finance the NGO sector? Before answering this question, it's important to underline the entire NGO sector is one big machinery for an immense turnover of money. A great amount of the cash flow on global level passes through the channels of the NGO sector, through various grant-making foundations, charitable programs, and corporate money for donations. If we follow the capitalist logics wherein the allocation of resources, part of the money goes to production costs, other part to investing in new production, and a third part goes to capitalists in the form of profits, then financing the NGO sector is contrary to the capitalist logic because it's quote-unquote unrecoverable expenses, which are most avoided in every company's policy. Then why would capitalists voluntarily give away part of their profits in order to finance other organisations? Propaganda says because they're philanthropists and they care for the community. Of course, every reasonable person knows that there is no such thing as a philanthropist capitalist, and that no capitalist, since he lives and gets rich off the blood and sweat of the miserable wage workers, cannot possibly mean any good to the community. The answer is, the financing the NGO sector has nothing to do with donating or philanthropy, but it is simply a way to strengthen the position of the business sector and to help it secure more future profits. In other words, financing the NGOs is an investment, and all financiers expect income from their investments. That income doesn't come back to capitalists directly as profits, but in long term, it brings bigger and more secure profits for the capitalists. For the big capitalists, which is how the NGO sector, promoting the quote-unquote values of today's society, helps keep capitalism alive. When a corporation finances an NGO who fights for democratisation and for economic liberties, as so many NGOs do, it will help the NGO to become an influential player who will help push the process of democratisation of society, quote-unquote democratisation, meaning deregulation of economy, meaning smaller control over the production, and monopolies, workers' rights, etc., which finally means bigger wealth for the big capitalists and even bigger misery for the working class. This is just one example. The same applies to financing other types of political quote-unquote political NGOs. We've really got to get better at that, which at the end of the day will thank their financier by increasing his already immense wealth, by worsening the position of workers even more, and by strengthening capitalism, who puts them in that position in the first place. So why does the state finance the NGO sector? Besides from the corporations, a large amount of money used by the NGOs comes from government funds, as in from our taxes. Governments, much like corporations, expect the same thing in return, a stronger position for capitalism and the rich. Let us not forget that the sole purpose of the existence of the state is to protect the rich and their position in society with the help of its mechanisms of repression and its monopoly on violence. Thus, it is expected the state would financially support the work of a whole range of organisations whose activities help maintain the status quo of the capitalist society. But to stay strong and dominant so they can properly serve the rich, the state must continually find new ways to impose its will and to justify its existence. With that whole quote-unquote citizens activity going on in the NGO sector, completely harmless to the government, of course, the state is given the chance to stage a soothing performance for the people, in which quote-unquote citizens can exercise their rights, participate in the policy making, socialise and identify themselves as free individuals. That is the great illusion of democracy, and the NGO sector helps keep it alive. That stage quote-unquote mechanism of struggle is not able to bring about any social change, nor was it created for such purpose, but certainly poses as such, so all those who believe that the demands can be reached through NGO activities will most likely completely exclude all other methods of struggle, which are in fact effective and actually pose a threat to the government, but are unanimously rejected by the NGOs as for being illegal. The government wins it all, a false mechanism of struggle, deceive peaceful and obedient people, and security for its dominion. The NGO sector is in fact one of the many mechanisms the state is using to enforce its dominion and justify its existence, but unlike the other such mechanisms like public education or the mass media, which are designed for systematic propaganda and control over the people, The NGO sector has a slightly different role. Namely, every government is aware that in spite of its endless efforts to keep its people in fear and ignorance, people are still basically rational and libertarian, and that the tiniest spark could stir up their anger each time they realise they are in any way oppressed. The riot is the greatest fear of every government, but modern governments know that the violent suppression, police state style of massive riots can only further ignite people's anger and endanger the domination of the state even more. That is why the modern government has come up with a more subtle solution. Instead of waiting for a riot to come and then deal with it violently, why not allow the masses to quote-unquote fight with a harmless weapon, that weapon being the NGO sector? Which quote-unquote methods of struggle are typical for the NGOs? Each time an NGO is doing some activity aimed at social change, whether it is some demands of the government or some criticism for government policies or anything else, that activity is almost exclusively within the institutional frames. Institutional frames are those set by the state in accordance with the official laws that impose the need for every political demand to pass through the institutions of the state in a firmly specified bureaucratised manner so they can reach the quote-unquote authorities, who will then decide whether they'll do anything about the issue. The state quote-unquote provides its citizens with a few bureaucratised, confusing, hardly accessible and completely useless legal instruments to defend their rights: complaints, petitions, citizens' initiatives, etc., etc. Whether we say that the ruling elites created the NGO sector or the NGOs appeared from below to answer the needs of the quote-unquote citizens, the epilogue is the same. The government is pleased with the NGOs because in their quote-unquote struggle, they never step outside of those permitted institutional frames, which makes them no threat to the ruling class. The NGO struggle is never on the streets, it's never violent, and it never aims at core issues in society. In other words, they're not a threat to any government. But they manage to recruit all those unpleased and angry, those who might throw Molotov cocktails in the Parliament building tomorrow, were already recruited by the NGOs, dressed in a suit, awarded with a wage and tied to a desk to conduct surveys and write reports, legal documents and smart articles for the quote-unquote progressive newspapers. Even if it was created with such intentions, the NGO can never go radical. It's simply too occupied with filing financial reports to its founder and chasing for new funds for next year's projects. A radical NGO cannot simply last because he wouldn't be able to find any funds to rely upon. The NGO can exist as long as there is someone to finance it, and no foundation, corporation or government would ever support radical progressive organisations. It is in this way that each NGO is being conditioned that its work will be supported only if it doesn't exceed the legal frames, and so its field of struggle remains very limited. That permitted field of struggle is one that cannot lead to any victory, since no real struggle is involved, but merely dialogue, cooperation and compromise with the authorities. The NGO is thus allowed to oppose certain aspects of the government, a certain law, decision, some specific injustice, a particular institution, etc. But it will never struggle against authority in general. The legal system is a way of preventing the existence of radical NGOs by imposing that each formal organisation must acquire a permit by the state before it's founded. The law naturally forbids any type of organisation whose goal is the total liberation of the people, or as the law would put it, a quote-unquote violent destruction of the system. Not only do the NGOs not contribute to any essential change, but by complying with the legal system and not resisting against authority, they effectively support the ruling of the political and economic elites, as they allow the government to rule in peace. The system is simply created in such a way to be able to stay intact by any attack that might come from within. That is why no change can be reached by institutional means. And that is why this oppressive system cannot be brought down by joining the Parliament. What can be achieved are some small reforms, a comforting compromise and the deception of the individual that he or she's done as much as he or she could. That same person will maybe think of different approaches to the problem, alternative methods of pressuring the authorities to fulfill his or her demands. He or she would maybe use far more effective means that would bring him or her closer to his or her goal. But that is where the NGO sector comes in to pull his or her chains, to remind him or her that we must follow the law, remain non-violent at any cause, and avoid provoking the otherwise benevolent cops who are only doing their job. What is the structure of an NGO? The structure of each NGO is nearly identical to the structure of any enterprise or corporation, highly hierarchical. The NGO has borrowed even the division of labour from the capitalist economy, similar to the division of stockholders, management board and workers in a corporation. Each NGO has its presidents, its council and its field workers, activists. Like any enterprise, each NGO inevitably has its accounting department, since although quote-unquote non-profit, it works with large sums of money, as well as managers of various fields and projects. Again, the legal system has thought of everything. So in pursuit of ensuring the inevitable hierarchy in the NGO sector, the law determines that one of the basic conditions for registering a formal organisation is that it has a listed president or leader, quote-unquote someone who can be held responsible. In Macedonian laws, it is impossible to register a horizontal or egalitarian organisation. Seems like the quote-unquote freedom fighters don't mind taking orders from their superiors in the NGO. Anyway, this is how the NGOs provide the state with yet another mechanism for training obedient, subordinated and consenting citizens. The NGO sector in the world, as well as in Macedonia, is completely professionalised, which is why insisting on calling the NGO activism volunteering instead of a profession makes no sense anymore. Furthermore, the NGO sector is the third biggest employer on a national level, right after the business sector and the state. There are such areas like Kosovo where the NGO sector employs far more people than the private business. Macedonia is not far from this scenario. When the NGO activist spends a number of hours every day working in the organisation, receives a salary for his work and doesn't have a quote-unquote real job, it is clear that working in the NGO is a profession like any other. It is true on the other side that many NGO-affiliated activists are in fact volunteers, as in they don't get paid for their efforts. But in any NGO, those are only the young, quote-unquote, young and experienced beginners who actually do all the physical work that is relevant for the NGO, such as conducting surveys in the streets, spreading propaganda materials, doing field work related to some campaign, etc., etc. A small number of activists, those quote-unquote most dedicated and most experienced, do get paychecks for their work, which usually consists of sitting on a soft chair in a private desk, monitoring the work of others. In other words, they get paid for bossing like capitalists and for contemplating about common problems in society and doing nothing about it like politicians. And what are the motives of the NGO activists? Of course, the volunteers do not engage in NGO activities for free out of pure altruism. They too expect many benefits as compensation to their engagement, such as job promising skills, working experience and valuable contacts to serve their future career. Some work hard hoping that they'll ascend to a higher position in their NGO and start getting paid. In fact, a lot of people spend their adult lives as professional activists, but even more among them continue their career at another working position they've acquired thanks to their NGO. So, hence participation in NGO projects and volunteering as an activist are virtues that are proudly printed on any CV, and every company takes those activities into consideration very seriously when deciding to employ somebody. The reason for that is the companies realise that the more the candidate engages himself in doing something for free, the more he or she will be expected of a hard labour for low cash. His volunteering merely guarantees to the company that the candidate was successfully trained to become an obedient, hard-working and compliant worker. Other NGO activists hope that their dedication, along with all the skills they learn in the NGO, speech organising, management, might bring them attention in the circles of political parties, who also search for hard-working and submissive workers to help them seize or maintain power, where they might be recruited as a party staff and then perhaps even seize some profitable position in the public administration. This is especially the case in Macedonia, where political parties monitor very closely all forms of organised dissent, so that they can find fresh, young and talented enthusiasts and recruit them in their ranks. Careerism in the NGO sector is a logical result. The entire NGO sector, being exclusively pro-capitalist, actively praises and promotes all the revolting quote-unquote values of capitalism, such as competition, rivaling with co-workers, use of all possible means to acquire financial benefit, taking all kinds of shit from those quote-unquote above in the name of career advancement, and sacrificing common needs for one's personal benefit. Egoism, success, competitive spirit, selfishness, rivalry, and a complete lack of solidarity are the quote-unquote values the NGOs are proudly taking from capitalism. The NGO activists are rarely ideologically oriented, for what drives them is not some desired vision of society, but their personal financial advancement. If they do follow some ideology, it's a capitalist ideology. What to do? To us who choose to resist the state of... I don't know if I should read this one out. No, what the hell. To us who choose to resist the state oppression and the capitalist exploitation of workers, it's quite clear that the best method to set ourselves free from the chains are those that are beyond government control. The only means that are truly effective are those who are rid of the mediation of the state institutions. Direct actions. Simply said, each autonomous action people undertake for political and social goals without the mediation of a third party, politicians, parties, courts, union leaders, legal experts, NGOs, etc., is a direct action. Massive direct actions have shown to be most successful during the course of history, especially such actions as mass demonstrations, general strikes, occupations of working places and of state institutions, blocking big roads, etc. Individual direct actions or actions of smaller groups of people are not as effective in resisting authorities, but can often cause a strong symbolic effect, which might serve as a trigger for future massive organised actions. For example, by attacking properties, banks, institutions, corporations, offices of fascist parties, etc. Not only do it cause material damage, but more importantly also publicly express our revolt against those oppressive institutions and thus inspire many others who share this sentiment to organise as well. Direct action means opposing the idea that we are powerless to change conditions that make us miserable. It means acknowledging the fact that no one from above won't solve our problems, and that we must fight for each change by ourselves. The representatives who promise to fight in our name not only do not care about our problems, but also they profit from our miserable conditions of living. That is why we know that if we want to start struggling for a total liberation from the chains of the state and of our bosses, the last place we'll go to is an NGO. We know that those institutional instruments the system offers us as means to protect our rights and make our lives better will only leave us stuck in the institutional labyrinths and empty-handed. Of course, that doesn't mean that in very specific occasions we shouldn't use the loopholes and the contradictions of the legal system in order to defend ourselves from any legal attacks. As anarchists, we should be prepared for the possibility of having many problems with the law and of enduring long mental pressures in the courts and prisons as a way to break our spirit. But neither the law nor any other institutional quote-unquote remedy the state is offering us can be our main means of struggle against the state oppression. And against our exploiters at work. We should remember that the law that we think is protecting us today can be withdrawn overnight if the elites find it too menacing to their privileged position. And most importantly, we shouldn't forget that the laws are written by our rulers and therefore they only serve to protect them from us. The NGOs, however, will continue to show up in every organised dissent and persuade us to join the institutional struggle. All of us who want to see some real effect from any struggle are obliged to reject their influence and to count only on their own power. The moment when an organised group will become such a threat to the government that the NGOs, those worshippers of the law, will retreat from that group at their own initiative. That's when we will know that we're doing it right. An effective struggle is the one that is capable of shake the foundations of the oppressive system and thus force the authorities to comply with people's demands. An effective struggle is the one that makes the government to be afraid of its people instead of the other way around. This cannot be achieved by petitions or lobbying. Well then, what should we do? We should organise at work. Every time we think the working conditions are no good, if our boss is cutting our wages, which stop the work in the entire company until the boss, fearing for his profits, complies with our demands. If they want to take away our social benefits, we should organise in our community and show them that it won't pass. If the state is adopting new and more repressive laws for the workers, we should organise a general strike and block the economy that is slowly killing us. A building built on bad foundations can't be fixed with a new facade. It must be demolished so that a new and better one can be built in its place. In the end, direct action is more than just a method of defending our rights and improvement of our life. Direct action, as was put by the anarcho-syndicalist Rudolf Rocker, is a quote-unquote school of socialism, or a way to prepare ourselves for the free society we all strive for. Direct action gives us control over our own struggle, gives us experience, and shows us how to learn from our mistakes. It helps us build a culture of resistance and solidarity, and connecting us with so many others who are in the same shit, gives us back our humanity, which was taken from us by the industrial society. And as we control our struggle, we will slowly learn to control our own life, and the more we approach freedom, the more we'll grow our own power to change the world. There you have it, Live Better. And that article again is the NGO sector, the Trojan horse of capitalism. Stay tuned for more lessons. Sometimes antisocial, always anti-tyrant.